Good morning. Welcome. I'm Maggie Bowman, the Interim Director of Programming and Advocacy at the IDA. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation this morning. My pronouns are she, her, and for blind and low vision audiences, I'd like to offer a visual description of myself. I am a white woman with shoulder length brown hair, with a gray top and bookshelves and a teal wall behind me. In response to an ongoing conversation that I've been having with a close Indigenous friend of mine about the practice of land acknowledgements, I'd like to offer up a recent article in the chat that provokes a conversation about the meaning and impact of such statements and how we could go beyond them. I invite you to read that at your leisure. I'd like to also welcome our ASL interpreters, Gabe and Elena. Thank you so much for being here with us. And just before we bring the panel up, I just want to make a couple of announcements. First of all, a content warning. We will be discussing difficult topics such as sexual assault and gender-based violence today that could be triggering or upsetting. We will do what we can to maintain a safe digital environment throughout the panel. If at any point you need to leave the conversation, please feel free to do so. Your emotional well-being is very important. Please also be mindful of the sensitivities of this topic when engaging in chat and maintain the intention of protecting a safe space. In an email this morning, you were shared our community agreement, which was developed for Getting Real 2020, and which we're carrying with us into our year-round programming. That's pasted in the chat as well. Finally, our collaborators on Getting Real helped, including a group called Healing Justice London, helped us develop some emotional support resources, including an aftercare sample menu and a list of English language resources for support beyond this conversation. We are recording this panel for internal purposes. However, due to the sensitive nature of the conversation, we won't be posting it onto our YouTube channel for public viewing. Finally, this is an open session, so please be aware that members of the press might be in the audience. I'd like to thank our funders today, the Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs, the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, the Los Angeles County Department of Arts and Culture, and the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. We will have a brief Q&A at the end in the last 10 to 15 minutes or so of the conversation, and you can submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, where someone will be moderating and sorting through the questions via that function. Okay, so now we're going to bring up the panelists. I'm very grateful to all of these panelists for joining us today for this conversation. And I will just wait for them all to join me on screen. Say hello, and when each of them begins to speak, they will do a longer self-introduction for each of themselves. But just to briefly introduce and invite, we have Sherizaan Minwalla, a human rights attorney, Nabila Rashid, a forensic social worker and a participant in a documentary, Daffodil Altan, a journalist and documentary filmmaker, Andres Cedial, also a journalist and documentary filmmaker, Belkis Wille, a human rights researcher at Human Rights Watch, and Natalie Bullock-Brown, who is with the Documentary Accountability Working Group, who is co-presenting this discussion with us today. Thank you and welcome all of you. I want to start off this conversation by acknowledging that the timing and the urgency of it was indeed inspired by a recent controversy around the film Sabaya, the documentary film. But I want to emphasize that this conversation today is not going to focus on the film specifically, nor the New York Times article about it, or the subsequent public statements by various stakeholders of this film. There is certainly a lot to discuss and many points of view that are coming out about it, but we really felt it was important to focus this conversation today on the broader issues of ethics in documentary, trauma-informed practices, and informed consent. So we're going to ask you to join us in that intention for the focus of the panel today. Ethics in documentary has been the subject of intense debate for decades, but there have been no widely accepted set of standards. The conversation about being trauma-informed in one's practice, be it film or any other profession, healthcare, policing, the list goes on, that is a newer conversation and one that we really want to delve into here today. There are so many aspects of accountability, ethics, and consent when it comes to documentary film and media. Many of them have been addressed in previous panels with the Documentary Accountability Working Group, which first presented on their work at Getting Real about a year ago and has more recently been sharing a set of developing guidelines with the field, including a truly wonderful panel that was hosted at Black Star in September that we'll paste in the chat, and I encourage you to take the time to go look at that. But so there's a broad range of accountability topics. We are going to focus today's conversation on the question of survivors of gender-based violence and start to look into what ways we ought to be informed about the experience of survivors and work to make survivors central to our focus of how we discuss ethics. So Natalie, I'd love first, and please feel free to introduce yourself. If you could, to help frame the conversation, could you tell us a bit about the Documentary Accountability Working Group, why, when it was formed, and how you're going about your work right now as a group?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Maggie, for this opportunity. My name is Natalie Bullock Brown. As Maggie introduced me earlier, I am a filmmaker, a professor. I'm a member of the Documentary Accountability Working Group. And I also serve as a strategist for Working Film's Story Shift Initiative, which looks at issues of accountability in documentary film, more specifically with funders and filmmaking practices. The way that the Documentary Accountability Working Group came together was really in the wake of George Floyd's murder last summer. Really in the weeks after George Floyd was killed, Sonia Childress and I published a piece that really tried to frame the conversations that a smaller group of us within the working group had begun to have at the beginning of the year. And in the wake of the murder and all of the protests and uprisings that took place, we became a little bigger with the addition of two people, Pat Ofter-Heidi from American University and Sherry Simpson. And I should say that the working group is rounded out by Molly Murphy, who's a co-director of Working Films, and Bowman Suchak, who is a co-director of Youth FX and Next Doc. And we've had quite a few incredible young people who have worked with us, Maya Sudar Casa, Hannah Hearn, and now Marissa Woods, who have all been sharing in this work with us. But what we're really trying to do is to develop, and what we're in the process of working on is developing a framework for values-based filmmaking. And at the core of that framework are 6 values. And I would say that the heart of those values is the value that talks about incorporating or integrating an anti-oppressive practice into your filmmaking work. It's the first value that we list in the framework, and it's important because when you approach filmmaking from that perspective, it requires introspection, to think about the ways in which you as a filmmaker have been conditioned to not only see yourselves, but people who are not like you, who have less privilege, who are from vulnerable or marginalized communities, and to really begin to identify your biases, and how your privilege and position to power informs your filmmaking practice. And so, with that value and other values that talk about transparency, and consent, and also just taking care of the people that are in your film, your participants, the people who crew your film, and so forth. We have been building out a framework that we have been slowly but surely sharing with the field, but that we hope will really focus attention on this issue of care. As the filmmaker Jim Lebrecht said to me a few days ago, when we really get right down to it, what we're talking about is how we treat each other. And so we really feel that at the heart of, what we're talking about today is this idea of, like, if we're talking about consent, if we're talking about trauma-informed approaches to filmmaking, we're really talking about how we look at each other, how we think about ourselves in relationship to people who don't have the power, and especially as filmmakers, like, no matter what your identity is, right? You have a certain amount of power when you have a camera. And so there are all of these issues that come out of just thinking about how we treat each other, how we take care of each other. And at the heart of it, as I said, I think is this commitment to anti-oppressive practice.
Thank you so much. And I know that we'll probably get into some of the details of the group's work later in the panel, but I appreciate that overview. Belkis Wille from Human Rights Watch. You exist in both at the intersection of human rights work, but you have quite a bit of exposure to the media world. And so I would love to hear from you a little bit about your work and how you approach media, because Human Rights Watch also has a film festival, but you're very aware of the ways in which media is relevant to the human rights space. And just curious if you could speak to what tensions you are aware of, where are the values of human rights work, documentary filmmaking, and journalism, where do they find tension with each other?
Thank you so much for having me on this panel and for that question. I did want to start by really acknowledging that there are some differences between what we as Human Rights Watch, as human rights researchers, are trying to do, and then with the media and with filmmakers. There definitely are differences, but I think based on what we just heard from Natalie, there are also a lot of similarities in terms of how we approach the work that we do. And the work that we do is interviewing victims and survivors of human rights abuses and really giving them a voice, a public voice. And so for us, free and informed consent really kind of sits at the heart of everything that we do. For us, free really means, that consent is not coerced. There's no prejudice to saying no to telling us information, to taking an interview request from us. And then for us, informed consent is actually an extremely lengthy procedure. It's a discussion we have with someone before we take any information from them whatsoever. And we really need to be very clear on who we are and what we plan to do with this information. And the reason I think this matters so much to us as Human Rights Watch is because to us, the concept behind all of our work and underpinning our research has to be the principle of do no harm. Now, do no harm doesn't really mean do no harm. It's impossible to remove all risk of harm, but it means do as little harm as possible. And so the reason we try to ensure that we're always getting free and informed consent is so we really are minimizing the risk of harm coming from the work that we do. You know, I can say from my own practice, you know, when I'm interviewing someone, for example, who might not be as familiar with what it means to be in a Human Rights Watch report, I actually bring a paper copy of a report with me, because, you know, someone really needs to understand what I'm describing when I describe how we're going to use their information. At Human Rights Watch, which might be sometimes harder to do in the media, is anonymization. So, you know, I've been covering Iraq for many years, and in Iraq, I actually anonymize almost every single person that I write about. That is not simply removing their names, but sometimes really removing all identifiable characteristics to minimize the risk that they will come under threat or attack because they shared information with us. I think a key other aspect of our work is ensuring that we stay in touch with the person that we've obtained information from, to make sure that there's no kind of retributive attack that comes to them later. And always before publication, ensuring that the person who gave consent has still retained that willingness to give consent. You know, sometimes I interview someone who says, of course, you can publish this information, you can use my name. But when I speak to them a month later, their decision has changed and they actually do want to be anonymized, or they don't want us to write about their case whatsoever. And it's so important that we know that and that we respect that. When it comes to multimedia work we do, which again is harder to do in the space of media and documentary filmmaking, is blurring people's faces, filming people from behind so they're not identifiable, changing their voices. And again, I recognize that, you know, if you're a documentary filmmaker, if you're in the media, and a key part of your job is getting an audience to identify with the character that you're portraying, that kind of anonymization can be quite difficult to do. So again, to really acknowledge that there are differences, but ultimately, I think at the crux of what all of us should be trying to do, it's this, you know, really thinking through how can we minimize harm to vulnerable people that are willing to give us their time and give us their words as much as possible.
Thank you. And I know that when when Daffodil and Andrea speak about their work, I think that, you know, I will love to hear, what does that mean? Like when she was referencing the challenges of anonymization and the ways in which you have to make decisions about your own work. Well, I'd love to hear about that from your perspective. But first, Sherizaan, I'd love to go to you. You're a human rights attorney. When people think of doing harm in a human rights context, they often might be thinking of perpetrators of violence, an autocratic government, etc. You decided to conduct research on the media and the impact that they have, which has often been overlooked in these contexts. Can you tell us a little bit about your research and what you've learned?
Yeah, so thank you so much for putting this panel together and for inviting me to participate and talk about our research. I did this research with a good friend and colleague who's a sociologist, Dr. Johanna Foster from Monmouth University. And as you said, I'm a human rights lawyer. I've been living and working in Iraq off and on for more than 10 years. And I was living here in 2014 when ISIS attacked Sinjar, which was the homeland of the Yazidi ethnic and religious minority community. And, you know, initially, women and girls started coming back in sort of smaller numbers when the spiritual council and spiritual leader, Baba Sheikh, said that the women could come back and the girls who had been abducted and subjected to brutal sexual violence and enslavement, they said that they could return to their family and community with their honor intact. That was rather unprecedented, and it was a really important move because it gave women the signal that they could return. So then we saw a lot of people escaping and arranging with their families and smugglers to be rescued from the Islamic State. as those numbers started increasing, we saw that there was a fairly intense interest on the part of the media in the stories of sexual violence in particular. So there are many crimes of atrocities. This was a genocide. There were killings. Children were indoctrinated. But the story of sexual violence in particular piqued the interest of the media, and the Yazidi community and survivors responded. So, sometimes you see in conflict that survivors and victims are silenced. In this case, they were really encouraged to talk to the media. And in some cases, they were pressured. And that was documented by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, human rights organizations. So we were really concerned. We decided to do the research because we were concerned about the way that the media was engaging with the victims and survivors once they returned to their community and they were living in displacement camps in the Kurdistan region in the north. We were concerned that the way that the reporting was being done was potentially causing harm. And we wanted to know the perception of the women themselves. I can speak on and on about what I think is or is not ethical, is or is not appropriate. I've worked with victims and survivors of gender-based violence for almost 20 years now, but we were interested in the voices of the women. And so our research was done with 26 participants. We did not inquire into whether or not a person was a survivor when we recruited the participants, but we did end up with 50% of the respondents being survivors. And we also never asked anyone about what happened in captivity. So we really stayed away from those questions that could really trigger flashbacks and trauma. And it really wasn't relevant. What we were trying to understand is, how did you feel about the way the media gathered your stories and reported them? So I'll just, in a nutshell, I'll summarize the findings of that first paper. There were 5 things that came out of it. The first finding was that a lot of the women said that survivors were pressured to speak to the media. And they were pressured by not only journalists, but also NGOs and their community. So in a number of cases, community leaders were pressuring women to speak to the media because they needed international attention on this case, and they wanted an international response because they were facing a genocide. So this is not to say that I'm in any way judging that decision to encourage the women, but it did really put them in a situation where they weren't necessarily free to decide whether or not to participate. The second finding was that women said, and so we're not psychologists, we couldn't evaluate, psychological impact of those interviews, but a number of women said that they experienced strong emotional responses to participating in these interviews. So that ranged from, intensive crying. Sometimes women would faint, they would have psychosomatic responses, and then they would experience insomnia, sometimes for days after giving these interviews. But then at the same time, some women did say that they felt better as a result of giving these interviews. And so in some ways that also really suggests that, they needed a non-judgmental sort of space in which they could open up and release, the stories that they had. And there weren't a lot of mental health services. And so, journalists, of course, are not mental health service providers, but the experience, when they had a positive experience, was something that some of the women did talk about. The third finding was that women said it was, despite the fact that it was very hard to tell their stories, they felt like it was worth it. They wanted to help their community. They had 2 priorities. One was bring our women and girls back and our families. They were not only women and girls, they were boys, they were men. Many of them had been killed, but they didn't know. They wanted them back, and they wanted international protection so they could return to their homeland, Sinjar. So they were willing to go through the struggle and the pain of giving their stories, which for many of them was the only sort of currency that they had, in order to try to get a response and support for their community. The fourth finding was that many of them felt betrayed and frustrated and angry because they kept telling their stories over and over to journalists from all over the world and from Iraq, and they didn't feel like they really saw a result that they had hoped for. So yes, there was a humanitarian response. Yes, there were psychosocial services. Yes, there was food, They were living in tents. These are difficult camps to live in, but they didn't get really what they wanted, right? And many of them are still displaced, and 7 years later still haven't gone home. When we interviewed them, it was 2 years after the genocide. So 7 years later, not that much has changed. And then the fifth finding, which was really concerning, was that the women said it was very risky for them to expose their identities. And that included showing their names, showing their faces, tattoos or other markings, anything that could identify them, where they were from. They were concerned about risk of retaliation for themselves and for their relatives in captivity. So one of the women who we interviewed said that she faced retaliation herself while she was in captivity, and that when ISIS saw one of her relatives on TV, they came and beat her and her family more. And another woman said that, if you look up Yazidi, just Google the name Yazidi, you'll find thousands of stories of women and survivors. And you'll often see this image of face covering. So their eyes are showing, but the nose and mouth is covered. One of the women said, and I just want to read this quote. She said, because I asked her, does that make you feel more anonymous? Do you think that that protects your identity? And she said, with photos, even with my face covered, I did not feel safe. They know everything about me. They can know me from my eyes. Even I know them when they are covered and just by their eyes. So 90% of the survivors said that they didn't think it was appropriate to show their image, 80% of the respondents overall. So I think though, those are the 5 findings. I think there's other sort of takeaways. One, what does it really mean to have autonomy and agency, to be able to give consent in a context where people are still unsafe and, they're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. A number of people were interviewed literally days after they were released from captivity. And so their situation was not, stable. And so I think that really, begs the question, like, what does it mean for us to say that someone can give consent? I know, fixers who would ask women, do you agree to give it an interview? Yes or no? Do you agree to have your picture taken? Yes or no? And that clearly doesn't really address the full range of issues that we're dealing with. I do just want to read one more quote from a woman. We asked them, why did you give the interviews? And one of the women said, she talked about the intense emotional pain that they felt when they gave these interviews. She said, it's difficult. And when they come here each time, we tell them our stories. We go back to them like a flashback. We go back again to ISIS. And I remember everything. We have flashbacks. They remind us of what happened to us. It's difficult. And sometimes when we're sitting together with our family and children and we talk about it, I have a pain in my heart. And I tell them, please, enough. I cannot talk about that. Please don't remind me. It's not easy. The most important aspect of this paper is that it does include the voices of the women. And we try to include a number of quotes to sort of show their perceptions in their own words. We did do follow-up research. We analyzed 75 English language publications, and I won't get into all of the details, just to say that, one of the sort of like the narratives coming out of that genocide is that these are women who are really passive victims who don't have really, anything else to say about themselves. And in fact, when you meet these women and you get to know their stories, you find that they're incredibly courageous people, but that wasn't really the story that came out of this genocide. And so I'm happy to answer questions later about the research. And that's just a summary.
Thank you so much. And thank you for doing the research. My understanding is that there is not a lot of research like this that has been conducted. And I hope that your research can be a model for more to be done. I also will love when we, come back to you to talk about what are some possible standards that could be embraced for, we know that, members of the media will continue to go out and seek stories of survivors. So moving forward, what are some standards? What is a way to be trauma informed? Because clearly this issue goes way beyond one film or even the region that you're talking about. This is an issue of practices that addresses many documentary filmmakers and journalists. So with that, I'd like to go to Andres and Daffodil to talk a little bit about your work, which has been years of experience building relationships with film participants. You call them, I know, sources as journalists. Andres, you often refer to that. But can you tell us a bit about how you work? What goes into how you decide who you're going to ask for consent, what you think about, and did this phrase trauma informed, where did you ever hear about that or learn about that in your work?
Thank you, Maggie. Yeah, and that research is incredible. Thank you, Sherizaan. The first thought I was having as I was listening to all of this is really we need to get this into newsrooms and journalism schools, because I think one of the things that we often find ourselves in a situation as journalists, we learn a certain practice, but we also have to engage in ways that actually belong. We're engaging sometimes as not therapists, but we're in a situation, we're in a psychological relationship with our subjects, sources, film subjects is what we use. And when we engage in that relationship, sometimes we feel like we could use, it feels like uncharted sometimes. You're going based on instinct, on life experience, because the ethics and standards in our profession do ask us to consider, why are we doing a story? Why are we doing it now? Increasingly and importantly, we're asking, who is the best person or the best collection, the best team to tell this story? There's an active conversation around doing away with the word fixer, because fixers are very much on the ground, active reporters, journalists themselves. They're part of the team. So we're engaging in all these questions about why we are going to do a certain story, how we're going to get into it. But the context of the world in which we operate is a deadline-driven, pressure-driven universe where we're trying to, quote, get the story. And I think one of the things that we're moving toward increasingly as well is collaborating with other journalism organizations so that we're not competing for stories, because that's what often leads to this frenzy. When there is a breaking story and there are, one of the stories we were on involved children when they were all being held in detention a couple of years ago, and there was a frenzy to get children to talk. And it's like, how are we handling this with the most care possible? And so I think what's important to remember is that I, as a member of the media, we're this large universe that includes daily reporters, daily television reporters, long-term, we're long-form narrative filmmakers. And what that means for us as journalists is that we often have more time than some of our colleagues who are parachuting in or who have the pressure to deliver a story in a day. And so what that means for us and the way we approach the stories, and we've done some films involving survivors of sexual violence and trauma domestically. But what we do and what we consider in that approach, who's gonna go on camera to talk about this is, often what we've developed over time is really trying to find survivors who have had the experience of already telling their story. So they've been through a legal process, they've been through therapy, they've been working with someone so that the first time they're telling their story is not to us, because that is a lot to hold. It's a big responsibility, and we are not totally equipped to do that. We're equipped to record, and we're equipped with the gear, and I'm equipped to listen, and I bring my intersectional life experience to the care that I'm engaging in. But I think for one of our early films, for example, we had an older white male correspondent who wanted to interview the mostly immigrant women survivors of sexual trauma. And we said, no, that's, just instinctually, that did not feel right. That did not feel safe for them. There was going to be a power imbalance that was going to further make them feel like they had to disclose maybe things that they didn't want to disclose. So our process together with Andres is a very careful process. But we're also trying to engage with the conversations and disruptions that are happening in our own field about how we approach these stories. Because we also, in our field, although we have standards and practices, there is a history that is, colonialist in the way that it approaches stories, in the way that it extracts and expects people to give over their stories. And all of that is an active conversation that we're having right now, because we cannot proceed in that same way. And I think that's why it's important that we consider who's telling the story. What do you bring to the story? How do you engage with your subjects so that they see that you're also capable of being vulnerable, that you're coming from somewhere? And practically, it also means we are transparent. We explain what our story is about and why we're doing the story. We talk about why we care about having them tell their story and give them the agency to decide whether they want to participate or not. And also, we also don't ask people to share everything. It's really about share what you're comfortable sharing, and that's it. You don't have to go through the play-by-play, because it's deeply traumatic. Other practices that we've engaged in is we often ask that the person, when we're going to do the interview, bring someone that they feel safe with, a partner, an advocate, an attorney, that they can then lean on during the interview if we have to stop, if we have to pause and just sort of take a break, or after the interview is over, which is usually a time when someone needs someone to just catch them. And the challenge that we have as journalists is that there are boundaries that we need to establish so that the relationship doesn't become confused. And so that the subject doesn't then believe that we're going to resolve some major aspect, that I think Sherizaan was saying, there's this expectation that by sharing the story and a film coming out, the justice will come. And we're very honest about, we don't know what will happen after the film airs. We don't know if this is going to lead, to the resolution of this injustice. Really, what we can tell you is we're trying to bring awareness about this story and bring awareness about what it is that happened to you. And often, we've dealt with class action lawsuits, we've dealt with patterns of sexual assault and violence. So we're trying to bring the systemic patterns to light so that there can be work done around that to resolve these systemic abuses and issues. But, we really try to just be plain and practical and honest so that people don't feel pressured, and so that they also understand that there's only so much that we're doing, and we can't promise that we're going to fix problems, but that it's also really valuable to hear directly from them, and then we just leave it up to them. And often people, like Sherizaan was saying, but they will decide to tell their story because they want to help other people, and we can't force that. We have to let someone come to that decision themselves, and that takes time. And that's why it's challenging, I think, in these deadline-driven, quick turnaround situations, when journalists are trying to get information fast in a quote, in an interview quickly, to have that kind of space so that people can really come to a decision themselves, so that they can understand what they're doing. And then when they sit down for the interview, they are centered and they're in a certain place where they know they have arrived here ready to tell their story.
Thank you. And just before we go to you, Andres, I just was so struck by what you just said, Daffodil, about the psychological space that we enter as filmmakers. And I know that on a call that we had beforehand, you talked about an attachment relationship that forms between an interviewer and a participant in a film. And that is confusing. And I think that for all filmmakers listening to this call, they can relate to that sense of confusion. Where do my accountabilities and my responsibilities lie? So thank you for bringing that up, because I'm sure there are some psychologists who are filmmakers, but most of us are not psychologists. Andres?
Yeah, I'd like to add, this is part of the discussion is trying to do as little as harm as possible. And I also just want to acknowledge that by definitions, the survivors that we're working with are resilient. And so part of our job is to be able to find people who are able to tap into that resiliency to tell these stories. Yes, the stories are more powerful when people show their faces and they use their own voice and their names. And the people that have come forward have been able to participate in films that have had great impact, that have changed policies, that have changed people's minds. And that's part of what our job is as journalists. And so finding the right people who are in that the process of dealing with their trauma, as Daffodil was explaining, is a really key part of this process. And then I think also what's important for us to recognize as we look towards guidelines is that it's not just up until the moment of air, but also what happens afterwards. And knowing that this is going to be messy, it's going to be a roller coaster. We're dealing with trauma, and that trauma is going to come up. It's going to come up in different ways, and it's going to be ongoing. And so we have to be able to treat people we work with care throughout the whole process, even after broadcast. I'll just share the anecdote of the piece Rape in the Fields. The main protagonist, Maricruz Ladino, who came out, she showed her face. She talked about her experiences. She was informed, she consented. And then when the piece came out, she got a lot of backlash. People started calling her phone, calling her terrible names. Her fiance left her. It was a really dark time for her. Meanwhile, we continued to do community screenings. We brought her along. She met Dolores Huerta, laws were changed, and she survived. And she got back together with her fiance. She's married, and she's participated in the subsequent film with us. But we were staying with her throughout this process because as much as we want to put safeguards in place, to Belkis's point, harm can happen and will happen, and being prepared for that as part of our process is something I think that we need to establish as our guidelines.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now go to Nabila, who comes to this conversation with a really interesting intersection of perspectives. She is a social worker and is on the front lines of educating people in many sectors about what it means to be trauma-informed in their practices, but also has had the unique experience of being in a film. So Nabila, welcome. And can you, I don't know if you'd like to which aspect of that you'd like to discuss first, being in the film or the work that you do, but we'd love to hear about both.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maggie. Also, thank you to everyone. I was just having aha moments as everyone spoke, just because of the ways that everything is connected. I am not a filmmaker, so my perspective is mostly going to come from just like my experience as a social worker. And I also just want to notate that I'm not a clinician, and I do much more macro work and more education-based work than I do anything that's very clinical. But I guess I can just start from, since, we're on the topic of media and just like what one does when interviewing folks that are in film or like, a documentary, what have you. One of the things that I was very much resonating with, especially Daffodil, when you were speaking, is this idea of like what, I know you want to talk about trauma informed, but all the things that Daffodil had mentioned were very much trauma informed. And I think oftentimes when we're thinking about, well, how do we create a trauma informed practice or environment for folks, especially if we're thinking about, interviewing, is instead of thinking about what happened, really thinking about what does this person want to share? Like, who are they? How have they been impacted, as opposed to getting into the nitty gritty of all the information. Just like as a side note, in doing a lot of the education work that we do within the field of gender-based violence, and for me personally, I do a lot of work covering topics of gender-based violence with the intersection of religion. So I'm Muslim, and so we're really thinking about Muslim survivorship and the ways that community functions in that particular situation for survivors to either disclose or not disclose. And even through our own research that we've done, we've noticed and identified several barriers to disclosure. And when we have folks that come to us and then recognize, oh, there's actually going to be a whole media frenzy around, let's say there's an imam who's, a religious leader that has been, exposed for sexual assault cases, right, within the community. Oftentimes there might be news outlets that want to cover these stories, and we'll sometimes get those survivors or victims coming to us. And so then it becomes this balance of who gets to share the story, why are the stories being told, and what purpose does that serve? And so if we're really thinking about trauma informed, right, as it relates to media, the question, at least for us as practitioners, as us as doing the work, as advocates, it's really thinking about who has the right to a story. You know, Andres is talking about resilience and tapping into that. And oftentimes we see folks really wondering, like, what does resiliency mean if what they're doing the whole time is surviving and trying to make it to the other side? Especially when, you know, there are so many consequences to sharing. In terms of my own experience, when I was getting filmed for the documentary that I was in, first of all, it took like about 3-4 years to film it. And I wasn't the only survivor in the film. There were 2 other survivors, and the relationship that I personally cultivated with the 2 filmmakers, it was a very positive one. So my experience was very positive. And I want to name that it was perhaps like very trauma informed. I went through several ups and downs throughout that whole process. And, you know, Sherizaan named it, Daffodil named it, Belkis, you're naming it. You all are naming all the things that I personally experienced, right? Which is whether or not I wanted to share something. Then the whole concept of safety was coming up. So like, if this were to get published or produced, or I don't even know what the technical terms are, you know, what will my family think, right? Because at the time, my family didn't know about any of the things I had been going through. What will my abusers think, right? Because I had more than one. So if the film got into their hands, would there be retaliation? What would the consequences of that look like? What would it do for, you know, my career, right? Like if my bosses found out. Thankfully, I was fortunate enough to work already within the field of gender-based violence, and I was doing direct service work with survivors. But, you know, there were just so many questions that were coming about. And then if we're thinking about intersectionality, like thinking about my identity. So like, what does that mean? Am I going to lose my community? And I think Sherizaan had mentioned this, but, you know, oftentimes again, going back to my social worker hat, when I'm interfacing with survivors and victims and they're in this situation of, do I share my story or not? Whether it's with a journalist, whether it's, you know, for a film, whether it's for a podcast, a lot of times we've noticed that there's a lot of pressure from the community. And I think, and that was named earlier, is sometimes survivors and victims don't want to share because that's not their pathway for healing, right? That's not their pathway of coping with what's going on and seeking justice, but they're getting these external pressures as a way, and I'm only going to speak within the context of how I work with the communities I'm with, but specifically for Muslim communities and Muslim survivors, this idea of Islamophobia comes up, right? We need to share this story because we need to tell everyone that like Muslims are not like this. And so there's all these different intersections of how one, in this instance, victims and survivors are portrayed. And so what does that also mean in terms of storytelling, story sharing, and, you know, creating a safety plan around that in terms of if one does share within this context, what happens? So yeah, there's just so many things that, you know, I can share in terms of all, you know, all the ways that survivors might show up. And then also during the process of filming too, right? Like survivors show up in very different ways as well. So even the concept of giving consent, one thing that we talk about a lot in terms of education within our field of work is consent can also be taken away or taken back. And so what does that also mean if, for example, I'm getting filmed? And I know one of the things that showed up when filming for the documentary I was specifically in is that one of the survivors, consent had to be taken back because they did not want her family like to be shown, and there were images of her family. So like, what does that mean in terms of filmmakers to be able to have the ability to go back post-production and make those changes? Because that's also a trauma-informed approach, is recognizing that oftentimes, yes, we're working with the individual, but the individual may also be impacted by those that are immediately around them. And so in our work too, we have victims and survivors, but there's also secondary and tertiary victims and survivors. So really just recognizing the expansiveness of trauma and how not only it impacts the immediate individual, but also when a disclosure happens, right? How are those folks impacted? And as filmmakers, you're naming it, right? Like that psychological relationship, you too are also impacted. And I also had, I mean, for the lack of a better word, that opportunity to witness that. So not only am I a social worker having the ability to have the language and name these things, but also seeing it in practice as a survivor and working with the filmmakers themselves, just kind of the breadth of their own experiences being exposed to sexual violence and something that was very close to their heart as well, and how they interacted with the content and with us. And, you know, it was very interesting to say the least. And so, you know, I really very much appreciate, like, Sherizaan, your research is phenomenal. And like, yeah, we need this everywhere. And just, yeah, just so much. I feel like I'm just doing verbal diarrhea at this point, just trying to name and get everyone's points. But that's just a little bit about what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much. And I wonder if you might just, when you and I spoke yesterday, the day before, I asked for just a definition of what does it mean to be trauma informed, and you had a really excellent definition that helped me advance my understanding of it. And I wonder if you could share that.
Yeah, so the way that we are defining it, and when I say we, I mean the organization that I work with, Heart. So the way we've kind of conceptualized it is that being trauma informed essentially means that you are thinking about and acknowledging all the ways the most impacted, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized person is experiencing trauma. So it's not just the trauma itself, but also thinking about how that individual is interacting with all the different parts of their life around them throughout like their lifespan. And so they're going to show up in different ways to you in different aspects. And so you're going to probably be interfacing with them in various ways. So being trauma informed means wholesomely capturing that individual in that sense and creating an infrastructure we can never create the safest world, but what we can try to do is create safer spaces for them. And so really acknowledging the ways that we're interacting and communicating with them and being transparent and being able to not only hold that space, but allowing them to be the driver, like in the driver's seat, as a result of them thinking about what is best for them.
Thank you so much. Earlier in the conversation, Natalie shared with us some of the standards that the Documentary Accountability Working Group has been developing. Over the course of the last week, I've gotten to know a couple of other sets of guidelines and standards that I think are really relevant for discussion here in our documentary field. And Sherizaan, I'm going to ask if you could speak about the DART Center guidelines and the myriad code and the stage that each of those guidelines is at and what potential that has as a source of really positive guidance for documentary filmmakers and journalists.
Yes, sure. So actually, if you don't mind, I kind of want to just back up to sort of what was out there when we did our research, because I started sort of asking the question, like, what ethical guidelines exist for the media when they're reporting on these kinds of sensitive topics? And the one thing that I found that was really relevant to the context were produced by the UN Global Protection Cluster. They have media guidelines for journalists and for NGOs working in a humanitarian context. So it was so relevant to what was going on with the Yazidis who had just been displaced from a conflict. I will say that I think what was interesting is that I was going to those cluster meetings at that time because I was working for a nonprofit in Iraq. They didn't know about their own guidelines and no one was applying them. I found out about them later when we did the research. So that was kind of concerning. The second thing is we found that the DART Center has excellent work on sort of dealing with trauma, both from the perspective of journalists, but also from the perspective of engaging with different communities who have faced trauma. And so they have quite a few resources if you go to the DART Center website. And I can't say that this is because of what happened in the Yazidi context, but the question of ethical reporting really got a lot of attention because it really was so problematic. And we saw it also in, with Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. So, we're seeing it again in Ethiopia. This is not the only context, of course. But I think because the women were put forward and so many of them were talking, it just like you couldn't believe the number of stories that were coming out. Since then, we've seen more guidelines come out, and that's been really inspiring and a really important conversation around how should people be doing this. And so the DART Center has developed guidelines that are more specifically tailored to conflict-related sexual violence. What's great about those is they are developed by journalists, for journalists and documentary filmmakers, and developed by documentary filmmakers. So, that's great because they're coming from inside the field, and they are currently available. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the link is shared in the chat. If it's not, we can share it. But they're really user-friendly, they're really practical. And I think that, again, because they come from people doing this work, like all of you, they're just really right on. The second ones, as you mentioned, Maggie, are the Myriad Code guidelines. So Nadia Murad, for those of you who don't know her, she's one of the most outspoken survivors from this genocide. She's Yazidi. She won the Nobel Prize. She is a UN ambassador on this issue. I mean, she's just taken on a number of different roles since escaping from ISIS. And she, has sort of lent her name to the development of guidelines for working specifically on conflict-related sexual violence. Those draft guidelines are currently available at the myriadproject.org, I think. And there are a lot of consultations that have been ongoing for the last year and a half. So they've reached out to many different people in the media, and I think in the film industry, survivors, human rights advocates, like a wide range of people. And so the sort of like final draft is expected to come out in February. And that will be like a working draft that will continue to be revised and I think finalized later in 2022.
And could you just give us a highlight, an example, a concrete example from either set of guidelines of what kind of, if we're talking about, because so much of ethics is a gray area. And I think what's interesting about the way that the Myriad Code was described to me is, can we find a baseline, like a baseline of behavior that is actually not a gray area, that we can all agree to is an ethical way? And knowing that, of course, there will always be challenging ethical quandaries. That is part of this work. But I wonder if you could just share one or two of those concepts with us.
Yeah, sure. I think one, of course, carries across both guys. So both of them sort of are grounded in like 8 principles. They don't exactly parallel each other, but I think there's a lot of commonalities. And so one is the issue of consent, and that it should be informed. And the question is really, like, have you sort of given that person enough information? Do they have the capacity to consent? And so the principle is sort of very succinct, but then the guidelines will go into more detail so that people can explore those topics and kind of get a more nuanced understanding to really help them make a decision about how they want to approach that issue. And then I think another one that comes up in both is really the question of, being careful about probing into really sensitive details. When you're talking about sexual violence, what do you really need to know? What are you trying to achieve with this story? What kinds of questions should you or should you not be asking? Because they don't really help with the story. They might just contribute to sensationalizing it, but they also can contribute to triggering trauma and re-victimizing the person. So those, I think, are 2 important examples that you'll find in both.
Mm-hmm. One that stood out to me when I reviewed it was just the concept that there should always be a woman present in the interview space. That if you are interviewing a survivor, I'm curious what you think about that idea.
I will say this, with the whole research that we did, I do believe it's very important to have a woman present in the room. One, just because the optics for the survivor can be concerning if there's only men in the room. They could associate men, just, their gender or identity by, like associate them with the perpetrator. So like it feels safer if there's a woman in the room. But one of the things that really struck me was that women did as bad a job of reporting. So they sort of had the privilege of being able to get into the space as women, and then they didn't sort of use that privilege to really be more ethical. So I think just by virtue of being a woman, you know, that might get you in the room, but, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person is going to do a better job, I think, or take a more ethical approach. And that, you know, I saw that over and over again. So that was really quite eye-opening.
Mhm. Thank you so much. I'm just curious of if anyone else thinks, you know, sees some potential in these guidelines and applicability to our field. There's been, you know, there's obviously this long history of work in documentary and journalism has been going on for so long without broadly accepted guidelines. So clearly there's some challenges to adopting something. Curious though, what others think about the potential that the guidelines, particularly, you know, the DART Center and the myriad code, but also the work that the Documentary Accountability Working Group is doing. What is the potential? What are the challenges with adopting guidelines like that in our field?
Can I just jump in to say that, you know, the reality is that there's a lot of work being done in a lot of different spaces to think about these issues, right? And I don't think that, I think that they kind of all do link together. Like they're all talking about similar issues, and you know, really trying to drill down into the nuances of what it means to have informed consent. I really appreciated the trauma-informed definition that Navila offered. You know, that's what we really need to be focused on. And, you know, I just want to just share and contribute to what we're thinking about, the idea that, you know, part of what the working group has learned, and this is from talking to participants in films, is that one, intention can be, like the filmmaker's intention can be really, really good. They can start off wanting to do the most good, and they can still cause harm, right? And we've sort of established that harm is almost unavoidable, but there is a way to mitigate it, and that is what we should be focused on. And I think that the harm comes when filmmakers do not, like, their intent may be to shine a light on an issue that affects a marginalized or vulnerable community in a particular way, right? But they use a participant or participants to tell that story, but don't take care of those participants, right? So you can't sidestep the fact that you have members of that vulnerable community that you're hoping to help right there, you know, in your film. Like, you can't make the film without them. So how do we not only think about the greater community that we're hoping to help as filmmakers and as journalists, I dare say, but also the people who we are talking to get that story told? How do we take care of them in the moment? And I think part of what happens is we are, you know, like we get up in our feelings about our intentions, but we aren't willing to do the work to really make sure that we are not causing harm in spite of what we think may be our best intentions. And just to cap that, I also want to say, to Navila's point, you know, the vulnerable communities that filmmakers often revisit over and over again to tell stories of trauma, you know, those communities are resilient. The people from those communities are resilient, but should they be, right? Should they have to be? And a part of the work that I think that the working group is trying to lift up is this introspection that causes us to realize how systems and forces are working together to conspire to oppress vulnerable communities, right? And how can we mitigate that? Like, what can we do as someone with positionality to power, with privilege, to mitigate the ways that those communities, those participants are being oppressed? So that the resilience is not the thing. Like, you know, marginalized people know all about resilience and survival. how can we help them thrive, get past that to thriving and actually doing well? So I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you so much. Anyone else want to add on to that? We do have a lot of questions coming in the chat, so I can just, if you have other thoughts, we can come back to that. But I'll start with a question here. In situations where interviewees might not be aware of their own rights with respect to sharing their personal story and information, how does one approach such conversations? So the person, is not aware, like what might their human, civil, political rights be? How do you have that educational conversation when you're also, as a filmmaker, hoping that they will want to participate?
I mean, I'm happy to start again, recognizing that as Human Rights Watch, we're coming in from a different angle, but we really do have a very detailed discussion with the person about who we are, what we can and can't do for them if they're willing to talk to us, and make very clear that there's absolutely no obligation for them to talk to us, even if, for example, they know we've driven several hours to speak to them, right? We need to make very clear, often we're working in humanitarian and crisis conflicts. So most of the foreigners that they engage with are actually people from humanitarian organizations that are giving assistance. So we need to make very clear, if you talk to us, we can't give you food, we can't give you water, we can't give you shelter, we can't give you any financial assistance, and we can't even promise that by you sharing your story with us, the abuses that you're facing are going to stop, right? We have to be extremely clear on that from the get-go. But as I said, I mean, we often, will even tell people that we've come to that area for another reason, to make them not feel, as I said, if they know we've driven for hours to see them, they might feel obliged to actually give us an interview. And so we'll often say, oh, well, we were going to this area anyway. It's absolutely fine if you don't want to speak to us today, or we can start talking to you. And if you, after the first question, don't want to continue this, then that's absolutely fine as well. So I think it's really important to have that foundational conversation from the get-go.
Anyone else want to speak to that from this, because this conversation is something that filmmakers have every single day. It's probably the most common conversation to have off camera, is discussing with someone, what am I doing? What is this film I'm making? Why do I want to talk to you? And this is I know as a filmmaker that the way I have had that conversation has evolved and changed over the years. It's really, that conversation is the heart of how this relationship begins. I'm just curious if anyone else can speak to that.
I'll add, Maggie, that I think it goes, similar to what Belkis is saying, but as journalists, it's journalist filmmakers, filmmaker journalists, we occupy this space where it's really just about breaking it down to the fundamentals, and just being kind of very as transparent as you can be. I mean, it's really like, this is why I'm here, this is what I do. And then, if we can, sometimes we bring, nobody uses DVD players anymore. So you just try to show, like, here's what I've done before. This is what our work looks like. So we'll send people links. We'll just really try to almost over explain, this is what we do, and this is what your role would be. And this is what we would be asking of you. And this is what it might mean to participate. And this is what the story is about. And you're going to be one of multiple people that are probably featured in this story. And it's just like there's nothing we should be hiding, essentially, and sometimes, even if we don't know where the story is completely going, we can be honest about that. We're talking about this broader issue, or we're trying to a lot of times it's about trying to understand a particular scenario, situation, or issue. So it's like, we're trying to understand this better, and this is how you would help, and you would shed light, and this is what we're interested in talking about. So it's really just like, how transparent can I be? How sort of fundamental can I be in my explanation, and honest about what it is that we're trying to do? Because I think that's what's really upsetting, and people can feel betrayed if you're not honest about what it is that you're doing. If you don't announce yourself as a filmmaker or as a journalist right off the bat, you don't want to deceive people. And often what I tell students is that don't also, like, you are not you're not a priority for people. Okay, like we're not so important. We are at the bottom of people's list. They don't want to talk to us. So begin there. People don't want to tell you their story. They don't want to talk to you. They don't want you knocking on their door. They don't want a camera in their face. So you have to start understanding that deficit, and then being humble and mindful about how you then engage with someone about the work that you're doing. And I feel like that's what is often lacking in these situations where, like Sherizaan was saying, even if the women going in, if you're not looking at yourself, if you're taking yourself for granted as a journalist or filmmaker and being too important about your work, then you're stripped of your humility, and you're not engaging with yourself and checking yourself as you're going into these spaces and into these conversations. And that needs to be front and center.
I think it's also really important to make sure that the participants have the chance to ask us questions and to really be aware of what we don't know about their situation. If we just come with a checklist of the questions and they said, yes, okay, maybe we're okay. But really letting them drive the discussion of whether they're going to be safe or not, given the complex realities of their lives. So things that have come up when we've had conversations, because we've done reporting both in English and Spanish, is that a lot of the participants who were immigrants here, maybe they didn't care if it came out in English because nobody was going to see it that they knew that they cared about. They were concerned that it was going to play on Univision in Mexico, and then their ex-husband was going to see it. But that came through a process of having to discuss where's it going to be, what different formats, what territories, what languages. But there's all kinds of things going on in their lives, and I think approaching it with the idea that they know best about making decisions about their safety should really be one of the core principles.
Thank you. There's a question that's come in that I think is important about children specifically. We've been talking about survivors of gender-based violence, but are there guidelines for dealing with children and consent beyond just children who have experienced trauma, but perhaps including those children as well? Guidelines or personal practices that any of you employ?
I'll say that at Frontline, we're very careful when it comes to children. It's like a different, almost like an extra sensitive lens in terms of if they change their mind, are they completely comfortable anonymizing, it's really sensitive with children. And so, parental consent is one part. If it's a child that's, if it's a teenager who's 17, 18, and there's a guardian that may be encouraging them to do this, and then they turn 18 before the film airs, we really just are checking with them all along the way to make sure this is all okay. So it's really, we treat it it's just like a high sensitivity when it comes to children. And because the fact of the matter is these things are out there forever. This is their lives. There's a record of this moment in their lives. And so what is that going to mean for them as they grow up? And so that's why we really are paying close attention to what it is that we would be asking of a child. Are they in a place where they can speak? What are their needs? What kind of support do they have around them to be able to share stories? Like I was saying, we did the film about the children who'd been in detention, and there were a number of different scenarios that we were engaging in, and a number of different ages, and blurring faces. I mean, it's just a default. So we're just extra super careful when it comes to children at Frontline.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can just add one thing. For us as Human Rights Watch, what we don't do is kind of like adopt a cutoff age where we say, below this age, one can't get consent from the individual, and above this age, one can. And we are much more guided by the conversation that we have with that specific child. Because, even if you have someone who's 18 or 19, but we get the sense from the conversation that we don't think that this child necessarily is understanding the full implications of what they're agreeing to, whether it's because of their age or some other reason, then that could be the wrong decision, right? To go ahead with the information that they're sharing with us. And so for us, it's really about making an assessment that's very specific to that child and the extent to which we think that the child understands and can actually consent to what we're asking.
Such an interesting point, because I think many of us have this 18 age of consent sort of like, imprinted in our brains. Sherizaan.
Can I add something? Everything you both said is so important. And I think, like the guidelines that you find in these different codes tend to sort of separate adults and minors by age. And I think that's a really important question, Belkis. Something that I saw that was very concerning in the ISIS context was, and the Yazidi survivors, is that, a lot of these survivors came back to a community that was broken. Often their parents were killed or missing, or, just families were split up. So maybe a young survivor is being taken care of by a distant relative, an uncle. And then journalists would ask that guardian for consent, right? Because sort of the standard understanding is if the child can consent, the guardian can consent. But then there's this larger question of sort of community pressure to talk. And we saw instances where minors who had, again, just come back from captivity, severely traumatized, could barely speak, like the uncle is saying, yes, okay, I agree that she can give the interview. And I think, is that enough to say that the guardian consented because he's taking care of her? I mean, I think, again, we need to sort of look at the question of, as Belkis was saying, and as Daffodil was saying, what is the larger context here? What is the situation with that person? And do we feel like even if that guardian is consenting, or even if the minor is saying yes, what other factors do we need to take into consideration to really maybe decide, this doesn't really make sense right now?
Can I just add, Maggie? Very briefly, I just want to also add that I think we have to, as filmmakers, think about our feelings of entitlement to someone's story. And that can be in terms of a child or, any other vulnerable participant. And not allow, that's where the introspection and the work comes in, that the working group is really trying to encourage. Because if you feel like you get to tell somebody's story just because of who you are, then there's a way that you're going to sort of sidestep, again, considerations of consent, considerations of care, considerations of your position to power and your privilege, and how that informs the way that you're going about even getting participants to be a part of your film. And, again, we have to think about how we are treating each other. And I can just say, as a mother of an 18-year-old, don't come for my child and not talk to me. He's 18, yes, but I'm his mom. And he still doesn't have a fully framed brain. So remember that. Let's think about the realities of what it means to talk to kids, no matter how old they are.
Absolutely. Another question from the audience that I think is really valuable. To what extent do you engage with psychologists to consult on engagement with survivors, to take their stories and ensure a trauma-informed approach is consistently embedded in the process of documentation, and also for the interviewers? And here I'd like to ask Cassie, maybe if you would post the Dream Hampton op-ed in the chat, which that Dream Hampton, who made the docuseries Surviving R. Kelly, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post last week. And just really the most powerful line for me of this op-ed was that she said, "I wanted a therapist on set and instead I got lawyers." And so this, the role that therapists, counselors, licensed professionals could play either on set, after a conversation, in the framing of a production. Any thoughts on how that could be part of a practice moving forward?
Okay, so I'll just jump in and lift up an amazing psychologist that the Documentary Accountability Working Group has been privileged to work with, named Dr. Camila Rashad, who has helped us as a working group to see the ways that we even, as we think about these issues related to participants and filmmakers and consent and care, have to rethink the way that, like, our perspective, because there are things that you can't even anticipate. Even, again, even when your intentions are the very best that they can be, even if you are someone whose intersectional identities resonate with those of your participants, there are still ways that you can cause harm simply because you are the person in power, in control, or that, or, you know, that's sort of the tradition, right, of our field. So, you know, I think it's really important that we as a field, filmmakers in particular, think about this idea of participants telling their story, especially stories of trauma, first to a camera before they get to talk to a mental health professional. That there's something like fundamentally wrong about that. And so we have to be aware of the needs. I mean, that has to be centered. We have to center the needs of the participants when we are dealing with trauma. And trauma is not just gender informed violence. I mean, there are communities who experience trauma every day, right? And it doesn't have anything to do with sexual violence necessarily. And so again, we have to inform ourselves of the things that we don't know about the communities that we hope to help and the participants we engage with to help us tell those stories.
Thank you. And I'll just highlight that I haven't read it yet, but there will be an article coming out in the next issue of Documentary Magazine about some other clinicians who've been involved with working with documentary filmmakers to think about audience care. So keep your eye out for that, because audiences are another party that's very important here. This is a great question. Can someone speak about the rough cut screening and how this unique event, where we look at the work in progress that's halfway to being finished, 90%, you know, somewhere along the way, how that unique event might even be an extension of the filmmaker's practice of care in the way it engages and seeks feedback from participants, community members, and nonprofits? And, you know, there is a debate. Should you show an unfinished piece to a participant in the film before it is done? That's one question, but I think what the questioner is asking here is more broadly. We've got a rough cut, something that, how do we think about that rough cut in terms of this practice of care? And Daffodil and Andres, I would really love to hear you speak on this, because I know in journalism, in particular, this is really contentious.
The standard practice is that you don't show the rough cut. And that's another, I mean, as far as the transparency that I was talking about, and I just wanted to say earlier, just on some of the comments earlier, I've often said I wish journalists, we were also attorneys, but I also wish we were also psychologists. Like, I feel like there's a lot that and that's why the DART Center is doing some great work around engaging more journalists to engage with therapists, because I feel like it'd be great if we could have a therapist on set all the time, but sometimes we're really running and chasing somebody out the door, and we don't have time to get everything together. And so, you know, maybe something we could have is someone we could call or something just for help in how to navigate. But as far as the rough cut, you know, one of the things that the discussion that's happening in journalism and is whether you should, and I know this is happening in the independent film world, is how, to the extent to which you involve your participants. And what we're dealing with when we're putting our films together are multiple moving parts, multiple narratives, and then accountability interviews and questions that we're asking of, you know, depending on what the systemic sort of breakdown is. And so we tell the participants that we don't bring them into that rough cut phase, simply because it's changing so much, and it's changing as the film is evolving, and it's changing often right up, and I mean, it's changing very close to air. And so incorporating but I understand the value of incorporating everyone's feelings and perspectives. It's really critical. So, you know, one thing we were recently talking about is there a way to make the full interview available to participants after, so that they just have their own interview as something that they can own? Or, you know, how do we, because really what we tell participants, and this is really actually true, is that if we talk for an hour, or an hour and a half or 2 hours, really what's going to make it into a film are it's like 5 to 8 minutes for our films. That's what ends up happening. Now, this is very different if you're doing a verite film and you're following one character over years. That's a different engagement and a different process, and different than the process that we tend to engage in. But we try to be honest about that fact, and we're not sure what bite we're going to use in the final film and the final edit, and it's such a process, and we're trying to be so careful and so responsible that to bring in all the participants to weigh in, it almost could take forever to get the film done. Now, that's not a reason to not bring them in, but I think that's why we don't and we can't. But there's a larger conversation to be had about the reasons historically that people haven't had access to, you know, their full interviews, and why they haven't had full participation when they engage, full participation during the filmmaking process. And I know it's different. I know it's different in the independent filmmaking world, that participants are sometimes brought in, they're co-producers, they have different roles that they play on their film. But in our industry right now, the lines are still very clear, and they've stayed that way. Like we still don't show rough cuts to the film participants.
And I think one thing that's important to note about the way that the journalism industry is changing, and I think the way that this conversation can help inform it, is that there should be, I think, different rules between how you are dealing with people depending on where your power differential is. So for instance, if you are holding the powerful accountable, there's a different set of rules of how you might approach them versus dealing with people in which you're in the position of the power as the storyteller.
We're out of time, but I did just want to ask Navila, who has been in that position of being in a film, what was your experience? Were you able to see the film before it was completed? And what were your thoughts on that question? And then we will have to wrap up.
Yeah, I actually did not see the film before it went live. I think I saw like the trailer. But again, the filmmakers had very explicit conversations with me and the two other survivors about, yes, it's like 3-4 years of filming. However, X amount will actually be taken. So we were very much prepped with all of that. And then also throughout the process, although we didn't see things, they were always letting us know, like, hey, we're going to cut out this part. Initially, we thought we would have it, or we need to redo this part, or we're going to kind of pivot to incorporate other questions that are more relevant. So there was always a consistent line of communication. So ultimately, when I did see the film, I was like, oh, wow, okay, great. like, yeah, they were right. They cut out a lot, or like a lot of things didn't make it. But it didn't make me feel any kind of way just because of that open line of communication.
And I do think we could have a whole other panel about the rough cut and the feedback process to the rough cut, which is a very, important stage of any film's journey. I just want to thank you all so much for joining this conversation and bringing all of your experiences and your care into this space. I'm really grateful, as I know our audience members are. And I want to thank our ASL interpreters, Gabe Gomez and Elena Lee, and our live captioner, Romana McGinnis, IDA staff behind the scenes, Cassidy Diamond, Susan Yin, Chriselle Sotomayor, Badatri Chowdhury, and thank you also for Sonia Childress for helping out in the chat, another member of the Documentary Accountability Working Group. Thank you all so much, and be well.